Hey viewers! Before we dive into one of the most incredible stories from World War I, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss our historical deep dives. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Whether you're tuning in from the United States, Europe, or anywhere else in the world, I want to hear from you. Your support and engagement mean everything to this channel. Now, let's get into this amazing story. Imagine charging across an open wheat field, your boots pounding the earth as machine gun bullets slice through the air like angry hornets. All around you, men are falling, screaming, dying in the golden grain. The German defenders are laughing, confident that no force on earth could cross that killing field and survive. They've done this before. They've massacred British, French, and now American forces with the same methodical efficiency. Their machine gun positions are perfectly interlocked, their fields of fire calculated with Prussian precision. But then, something impossible happens. A small group of Marines, we don't even know their names, stumbles into a depression in the ground, a fold in the terrain that the Germans never properly defended. Within hours, the hunters become the hunted. Machine gun positions that seemed invincible are overrun from behind. German soldiers, moments ago laughing at the soft Americans, are now panicking, abandoning weapons, fleeing through the woods. An entire defensive line that took weeks to construct collapses in a single afternoon. How did a platoon-sized element achieve what battalions had failed to do? Stay tuned, because this story defies everything you think you know about World War I combat. June 11, 1918. Belleau Wood, France. Just 39 miles from Paris. The morning mist hung thick over the French countryside, clinging to the wheat fields like a shroud. For 3 weeks, the German spring offensive, Operation Blücher, had been hammering Allied lines, pushing closer and closer to the French capital. If Paris fell, the war might be lost. Standing in the way was the United States 2nd Division, and specifically, its 4th Marine Brigade, comprising the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments. These weren't the battle-hardened veterans that would storm Pacific Islands decades later. These were young men, most in their early 20s, who'd trained stateside and crossed the Atlantic believing they were invincible. Some had been farmers. Others had been factory workers, students, immigrants seeking citizenship. Now they were Marines, standing in the path of the German war machine. The Germans facing them were no amateurs either. The 237th Infantry Division, supported by elements of the 28th Division, had been fighting continuously since March 1917. They knew this ground. They'd prepared it meticulously. Belleau Wood itself was a dense hunting preserve, once used by wealthy Parisians to shoot game. Now it bristled with machine gun nests, hidden in the rocks and ravines that cut through the thick undergrowth. The Germans had turned every natural fold in the terrain into a killing zone. On the American side, Major Frederick Wise commanded the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. At 0400 hours, he received his orders: attack through Belleau Wood, break the German line, and drive them out. Simple words. Impossible task. The initial attacks on June 6 had been catastrophic. Marines had advanced across open ground in parade formation, only to be cut down by machine guns they never saw. The wheat fields had turned red with American blood. But orders were orders. The attack would go forward at dawn. Lieutenant Colonel Wise was a no-nonsense officer, skeptical of headquarters' understanding of the battlefield. He'd wanted to attack from a different angle, farther north, where the terrain might offer more cover. He was overruled. So on this cool morning, as fog drifted across the wheat fields, his Marines fixed bayonets and prepared to charge into the teeth of German guns once again. Most of them knew they weren't coming back. They went anyway. That's what Marines do. What none of them knew, not Wise, not the company commanders, not the Marines in the ranks, and certainly not the Germans, was that by day's end, everything would change. The United States Marine Corps of 1918 was fighting for its very existence. For decades, critics had questioned whether the Corps was even necessary, a naval force without clear purpose in the modern era. The armies saw them as redundant. Navy leadership debated disbanding them altogether. The Marines needed to prove themselves, and World War I was their chance. When America entered the war in April 1917, the Marine Corps numbered only about 13,000 men. By mid-1918, it had expanded to over 75,000, but most were green recruits with minimal training. The 4th Marine Brigade, however, represented the Corps' best. The 5th and 6th Marine Regiments had attracted volunteers from across the country, men who wanted to be part of something elite, something special. They arrived in France in October 1917, and by June 1918, they'd been assigned to the U.S. Army's 2nd Division under Major General Omar Bundy. The relationship was uneasy. Army officers questioned whether Marines could handle sustained combat. Marines bristled at being subordinate to the Army. But they were about to get their chance to prove themselves. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 represented Germany's last gamble to win the war before American troops arrived in overwhelming numbers. Having defeated Russia on the Eastern Front, Germany transferred nearly 50 divisions west and launched a massive assault on March 21, 1918. By May, they'd punched through Allied lines in multiple sectors, advancing closer to Paris than they'd been since 1914. Operation Blucher, launched on May 27, 1918, aimed to draw Allied reserves away from Flanders, where Germany planned its decisive blow. The German 7th Army smashed through French defenses along the Chemin de Dames Ridge, advancing 30 miles in 3 days. Panic seized Paris. The French government prepared to evacuate. Roads clogged with refugees fleeing the advancing Germans. On June 1, the U.S. 2nd Division received emergency orders: move immediately to plug the gap in French lines near Château-Thierry. The 4th Marine Brigade conducted a forced march of over 6 miles through the night, arriving at dawn on June 2 to find French troops in full retreat. As colonial French units streamed past them heading south, a French officer shouted warnings to Marine Captain Lloyd Williams: "Retreat! The Germans are coming!" Williams' response became legendary: "Retreat, hell! We just got here." That defiance captured the Marines' attitude perfectly. They'd traveled 3,000 miles to fight, and they weren't backing down. But bravery without bullets doesn't win battles. The Marines dug in along a defensive line north of the Paris-Metz highway, with Belleau Wood directly to their front. Through binoculars, they could see German troops moving through the trees. Artillery fire crashed down sporadically. The Germans were probing, testing, preparing their next assault. The stage was set for what would become the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history until Tarawa, 25 years later. American propaganda painted the Germans as brutal Huns, but German soldiers had their own propaganda about Americans. Intelligence reports from the German 237th Division described American troops as raw and undisciplined, soldiers who would break at the first serious resistance. German officers believed Americans, with only months of training, couldn't possibly match soldiers who'd been fighting for 4 years. One German company commander wrote in his diary, "The Americans will learn today what war really means. Their cowboys and farmers will run like rabbits." This confidence wasn't entirely unfounded. The initial Marine attacks on June 6 had seemed to confirm German assumptions. Watching from their fortified positions, German machine gunners had been shocked to see Americans advancing in straight lines across open ground, as if on a parade field. It was a slaughter. Marines fell in windrows, mowed down by interlocking machine gun fire. German veterans who'd fought the British and French couldn't believe what they were seeing. "They come at us like it's 1914, one German sergeant wrote. "Don't they know better?" But there was something the Germans didn't understand about these Marines. Unlike conscript armies, these were volunteers. Every man had chosen to join the Corps. They'd endured brutal training at Paris Island and Quantico, where drill instructors had literally beaten toughness into them. More importantly, they'd absorbed the Marine Corps' warrior ethos: never quit, never retreat, never surrender. Where other troops might break under such casualties, the Marines just kept coming. The Germans also underestimated American marksmanship. Marine recruits spent hours on rifle ranges, and many came from rural backgrounds where shooting was a way of life. The standard Marine rifle qualification was more demanding than most European armies required. When Marines got close enough to use their Springfield rifles effectively, Germans discovered that Americans could shoot, and shoot accurately. Still, German confidence in their defensive positions was justified. Belleau Wood was a nightmare of natural obstacles and man-made fortifications. The woods covered about 1 square mile, filled with thick underbrush, boulder fields, ravines, and rocky outcroppings. Streams cut through the terrain, creating natural barriers. The Germans had surveyed every approach, calculated every firing angle, and positioned their machine guns to create overlapping fields of fire. The machine gun nests themselves were masterpieces of defensive engineering. Each position was dug into the ground or built into natural rock formations, camouflaged with branches and earth. Gunners had prepared range cards, marking exact distances to key terrain features. They'd cut fields of fire through the underbrush, creating invisible lanes of death. Supporting positions covered each machine gun, so attacking troops couldn't flank them without being caught in crossfire. Telephone lines connected the positions to artillery observers, who could call down devastating fire on any American advance. From their positions, German soldiers watched the Marines prepare for another attack. They cleaned their machine guns, stacked ammunition, and waited. Some wrote final letters home. Others simply smoked and joked about the American stupidity. Few doubted the outcome. The woods were impregnable. The Americans would attack, die in great numbers, and eventually withdraw. It had happened before. It would happen again. They were wrong. The wheat field between the Marine positions and Belleau Wood stretched approximately 400 yards, an eternity when bullets are flying. The wheat itself had grown waist-high, golden and swaying in the morning breeze. Under different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. Today, it was a killing ground. The wheat offered concealment but not cover, meaning men could hide in it, but bullets passed through it as if it weren't there. German machine gunners had already pre-registered their weapons to sweep the field at various heights. They could fire blind and still hit targets. Previous attacks had left bodies scattered through the grain, silent reminders of the field's lethality. The terrain sloped gently upward toward Belleau Wood, providing German gunners on the wood's edge with perfect observation over the entire field. They could see Marines assembling for the attack long before the whistle blew. The early morning fog on June 11th provided some cover, but it was burning off quickly as the sun rose. By 0400 hours, when the Marines began their advance, visibility was improving, bad news for the attackers. Belleau Wood itself was approximately 1 mile long and half a mile wide, oriented roughly north-south. The western edge, where the Marines would enter, rose sharply in places, with rocky outcroppings and small cliffs that provided natural defensive positions. Inside the woods, visibility dropped to just a few yards due to thick undergrowth and second-growth timber. Paths were rare and easily covered by machine guns. Rocky streams running through ravines provided the only clear routes, but these were obvious avenues of approach and heavily defended. What the Marines didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the terrain contained a critical flaw in the German defensive plan. A natural depression ran across the wheat field, deepening as it approached the wood's edge. Where it entered the woods, it became a gully approximately 20 yards wide, carved by a small stream. This gully represented dead ground, terrain that couldn't be observed or fired upon from most German positions. More critically, the gully's entrance into the woods lay between prepared German defensive positions. The machine gun nests on Hill 169 to the north couldn't depress their guns enough to cover the gully's interior. Positions to the south, near what would later be called the rocks, had their fields of fire oriented toward different avenues of approach. The gully itself wasn't defended because German planners had assumed it was too narrow and difficult to be used by a significant attacking force. They were right, but they hadn't counted on a small, desperate group of survivors using it as a route into their rear. The weather on June 11th started cool and foggy but would become warm by midday. The fog was both blessing and curse. It concealed the Marines' initial movement but also made it impossible to see German positions until they opened fire. The ground was dry, which meant good footing but also meant that every footstep kicked up dust. Artillery had already churned up much of the ground, creating shell holes that could provide temporary cover if Marines could reach them alive. At 0345 hours, Marines of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines received the order, "Fix bayonets." The sound of steel sliding from scabbards echoed along the line, a metallic whisper that meant death was coming. Company commanders synchronized watches. Squad leaders gave last-minute instructions in hushed voices. Some Marines prayed. Others wrote hasty notes and tucked them in pockets, hoping someone would mail them home if they didn't make it. Major Wise positioned himself near the battalion command post, watching his Marines prepare. He'd argued against this approach, but orders were orders. He'd positioned the CP closer to the action once the assault began. His Marines knew the drill: advance in waves, maintain intervals, keep moving no matter what. The moment they stopped in that wheat field, they died. At 0400 hours exactly, the whistles blew. Marines rose from their positions and began moving forward through the pre-dawn gloom. The fog helped initially. German observers couldn't see them clearly. First wave, second wave, third wave, they moved like ghosts through the wheat. 50 yards. 100 yards. Still no fire. Some Marines dared to hope the Germans had withdrawn during the night. Then the fog began to lift. At approximately 150 yards from the wood line, the first German machine gun opened fire. Then another. Then 10, 20, the entire defensive line erupted. The sound was overwhelming, not the crack of individual shots but a continuous roar, like tearing canvas magnified 1,000 times. Tracer rounds cut red lines through the morning air. Marines fell like wheat before a scythe. The first wave was decimated within seconds. Men who'd been joking minutes earlier simply dropped, dead before they hit the ground. Others fell wounded, screaming for corpsmen who couldn't reach them through the fire. The wheat that had concealed their advance now hid nothing. German gunners fired into the Golden Sea, knowing they were hitting flesh. But the Marines didn't stop. Those who survived the first burst kept moving forward. They ran, dropped into shell holes, fired blindly at muzzle flashes, then ran again. Squad leaders screamed encouragement, "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Some Marines never heard the bullets that killed them. Others felt the impact, like being hit by a baseball bat, before shock and then darkness claimed them. The second wave hit the same wall of fire. Then the third. Casualties mounted catastrophically. In some platoons, every officer and NCO fell within minutes. Junior Marines found themselves in command of whatever survivors clustered around them. Still they advanced, because that's what Marines do. Approximately 200 yards into the advance, a small group of Marines, historians estimate perhaps 15 to 20 men from multiple platoons, their original units shattered, moved instinctively toward lower ground, seeking any protection from the murderous fire. They stumbled into the depression that ran through the wheat field. It wasn't much, perhaps 3 feet deep at most, but it was enough to get below the worst of the machine gun fire. They didn't know it yet, but they'd found the key to breaking the entire German line. The Marines in the depression realized they'd found miraculous shelter. Bullets still cracked overhead, but the machine guns couldn't depress low enough to reach them directly. They'd lost their original leaders. No one knew who was in command anymore. A corporal named someone whose name history never recorded took charge simply by being the loudest, most confident voice in the chaos. "Follow the low ground," he shouted. "Stay in the depression." They moved forward in a crouch, following the fold in the terrain toward the woods. Other Marines, seeing them advance, tried to join them, but German fire cut most down before they could reach the relative safety. The small group, now perhaps a dozen men, reached the wood line and discovered the gully. It was like stepping into a different world. One moment they were under withering fire, the next, they were in dead ground, temporarily safe. The gully was roughly 20 yards wide, cut by a small stream that trickled over rocks. Dense brush and scattered boulders provided additional concealment. Most importantly, they were behind the German forward defensive line. They caught their breath, checked ammunition, and looked at each other with wild eyes. They'd survived the impossible. One Marine later recalled, "We were scared, exhausted, and confused. None of us knew what to do next. But we sure as hell weren't going back across that field." Then they heard German voices. Moving carefully up the gully, they spotted a machine gun position, but it was oriented the wrong way, firing at Marines still trying to cross the wheat field. The gunners' backs were to the gully. They had no idea Americans had gotten behind them. What happened next was pure Marine Corps violence. The Marines didn't hesitate. They rushed the position from behind, bayonets fixed. The German crew didn't have time to react. In seconds, the position was overrun. The Marines turned the captured machine gun around and began firing at other German positions, which were now silhouetted against the morning light. Panic rippled through the German line. Machine gunners realized that Americans were behind them. Some tried to rotate their guns to face this new threat, but the heavy weapons were mounted on fixed tripods. Rotating them took time they didn't have. Marines appeared from the gully like demons, attacking with bayonets and rifle butts. The carefully planned German defense began to unravel. Other Marines, seeing that someone had breached the wood line, pushed forward with renewed determination. They poured into the gully, following the path the first group had blazed. Within minutes, dozens of Marines were inside Belleau Wood, expanding the breach. The small group of survivors who'd found the gully kept moving, rolling up the German defensive line from behind. Each position they overran made the next one easier. German troops, trained to fight forward against attacking forces, found themselves under fire from their rear. It was their worst nightmare. The defensive line that had seemed impregnable minutes earlier was collapsing from the inside. The breakthrough that German commanders had thought impossible was happening. And it was accelerating. The psychological impact on German defenders was immediate and devastating. For days, they'd watched Americans die in the wheat field, confident in their superiority. Now, suddenly, their carefully prepared positions were being overrun by screaming Marines attacking from unexpected directions. German machine gun crews faced an impossible choice: maintain fire on Marines still crossing the field, or rotate their weapons to face the threat behind them. Either choice left them vulnerable. Those who tried to rotate found that their heavy Maxim machine guns, mounted on 60-pound tripods, couldn't be repositioned quickly. By the time they'd unbolted the weapons and tried to shift them, Marines were already on them. The sound of combat changed. The methodical chatter of machine guns gave way to rifle fire, shouting, and screams. German officers tried to organize counterattacks, but in the dense woods, unit cohesion dissolved. Squads became separated. Communication lines were cut. The telephone systems that had connected defensive positions to artillery support and headquarters went dead as Marines severed wires or killed the operators. One German lieutenant later wrote in his diary, "The Americans came from everywhere and nowhere. We'd see muzzle flashes from positions we'd cleared minutes earlier. We couldn't tell friend from enemy." The woods became chaos. For German troops who'd fought the British and French for years, this was different. They'd never encountered enemies who seemed to have no regard for casualties, who kept attacking even after suffering devastating losses. One German private wrote, "They die, but they don't stop. Kill one, and two more appear. They have no fear." This was psychological projection. The Marines were terrified, exhausted, and desperate. But they channeled that fear into aggression, a fundamental aspect of Marine Corps training. Attack through the ambush. Close with the enemy. Never retreat. The ferocity of their assault made German defenders believe they faced a force much larger than reality. Rumors spread through German lines: "A full battalion has broken through. They have reinforcements. We're surrounded." None of this was true. The breakthrough force was still just platoon-sized, but in the confusion of forest combat, perception became reality. German officers realized their defensive plan had a fatal flaw. They'd prepared to fight in one direction, westward, against attackers coming from the wheat field. Now they faced threats from multiple directions simultaneously. Their interlocking fields of fire, so effective against frontal assault, became meaningless when Americans were shooting them in the back. The psychological advantage shifted completely. Marines who'd been terrified crossing the wheat field now sensed German panic and pressed their advantage. They moved aggressively through the woods, clearing position after position. German troops, moments ago confident defenders, now worried about being cut off and captured. Some fought to the death. Others abandoned their weapons and fled deeper into the woods. The fog of war worked against the Germans now. They couldn't see how small the actual breakthrough force was. Every gunshot, every explosion seemed to indicate more Americans. German commanders, receiving fragmented reports from panicked survivors, believed they faced a major assault and began pulling troops back to secondary positions. What had been a battle of attrition became a rout. The Marines, without realizing it, had achieved the breakthrough that would decide the entire battle. By mid-afternoon on June 11th, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines had accomplished what weeks of fighting hadn't achieved. They'd broken through the German defensive line and cleared most of Belleau Wood's southern sector. But the victory came at a staggering price. The casualty figures were horrific. The battalion suffered over 50% casualties during the assault. Some companies lost every officer. Platoons that had started the day with 40 men ended with fewer than a dozen. The wheat field was carpeted with American dead and wounded, their bodies marking the advance like mile markers on a road of death. Captain Lloyd Williams, who defiantly declared, "Retreat, hell," days earlier, was mortally wounded during the fighting. Navy Lieutenant Orlando Petty, a medical officer, earned the Medal of Honor for his heroic efforts to save wounded Marines, personally carrying Captain Williams back to safety even after being wounded and gassed himself. Williams died the next day. The German 237th Division's casualties were equally severe. Entire companies ceased to exist as fighting units. Machine gun crews that had seemed invincible hours earlier lay dead around their weapons. One German company that had started the battle with 120 men counted only 30 survivors. A German private wrote, "We have Americans opposite us who are terribly reckless fellows." Abandoned German equipment littered the woods: machine guns, rifles, helmets, packs, everything discarded by troops fleeing the Marines' advance. Prisoners were few because the fighting was so intense that quarter was rarely offered or accepted. This was close-quarters combat at its most brutal: bayonets, rifle butts, knives, even fists and rocks. The Americans who'd found the gully and sparked the breakthrough? Most of them didn't survive. They'd led the charge deeper into the woods, overrunning position after position, until German reinforcements arrived and cut them off. Some fought until they ran out of ammunition. Others were killed in hand-to-hand combat. We don't know their names. We don't have photographs. They remain anonymous heroes whose sacrifice made victory possible. Lieutenant Colonel Wise, commanding the battalion, didn't understand what had happened until hours later. He'd expected another costly failure. Instead, his Marines had broken through and were consolidating positions deep inside Belleau Wood. When reports reached him that they'd advanced completely across the woods, he initially refused to believe it. His Marines had been lost, turned around in the dense forest, thinking they'd cleared the woods northward when in fact they'd driven straight across its narrow waste. But they'd done it. The German southern defensive line was destroyed. Over the next days, fighting continued as the Germans reinforced positions in the northern section of the woods, but the critical breakthrough had been achieved. The Marines had proven they could not only fight but could overcome some of the most determined defenders in the German army. The battle wouldn't officially end until June 26th, after weeks of additional combat, but June 11th was the decisive day. A small group of Marines, finding an undefended gully, had changed everything. Their names are lost to history, but their accomplishment became legend. The Battle of Belleau Wood transformed the United States Marine Corps from a small naval auxiliary into an elite combat force. The ferocity and determination Marines displayed convinced both allies and enemies that American troops were formidable warriors. The French, in recognition of the Marines' sacrifice, renamed Belleau Wood Bois de la Brigade de Marine, Wood of the Marine Brigade. It's the only time in French military history they've renamed a battlefield to honor foreign troops. The battle also allegedly earned Marines the nickname Teufelhunden, devil dogs, from German troops, though historians debate whether Germans actually used this term. Regardless, the name stuck, becoming an unofficial Marine Corps nickname that endures today. German respect for American fighting ability increased dramatically after Belleau Wood. Intelligence reports that had described Americans as raw and undisciplined were revised to warn that American Marines were extraordinarily aggressive and difficult to defeat. Tactically, the battle demonstrated several critical lessons. First, terrain analysis matters. The German defensive plan was excellent except for one fatal flaw: the undefended gully. Proper reconnaissance would have identified this dead ground and either defended it or created obstacles to prevent its use. Modern military doctrine emphasizes identifying such gaps before combat, a lesson written in Marine blood at Belleau Wood. Second, the breakthrough illustrated the importance of tactical flexibility and initiative at the lowest levels. The Marines who found the gully didn't wait for orders. They exploited the opportunity immediately. In modern military terminology, this is called mission-type orders, or commander's intent, giving small unit leaders the authority to make decisions without waiting for permission from higher command. The German army ironically pioneered this concept, yet at Belleau Wood, Marines demonstrated it better. Third, the battle proved that determined infantry can overcome prepared defenses, but at tremendous cost. The casualty rates, approximately 50% for attacking units, were unsustainable. This lesson influenced Marine Corps development of amphibious assault doctrine in the 1930s, emphasizing combined arms operations, infantry, armor, artillery, and air support working together, rather than relying on infantry alone. The psychological impact resonated beyond the battlefield. For the Marine Corps, Belleau Wood became the defining moment that justified its existence. When critics argued for disbanding the Corps, Marines pointed to Belleau Wood as proof of their value. Every Marine recruit learns about Belleau Wood during training, cementing it in institutional memory. For individual Marines who survived, the battle became the central experience of their lives. Veterans formed associations, attended reunions, and ensured the story passed to younger generations. Gunnery Sergeant Ernest Jansen, who earned the Medal of Honor at Belleau Wood, exemplified the Marine spirit, attacking 12 German soldiers with his bayonet, killing 2 before the others fled. The unidentified Marines who found the gully represent thousands of anonymous heroes whose individual stories are lost but whose collective sacrifice built the Marine Corps' reputation. We don't know their names, but we honor their memory every time we say, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. They crossed that wheat field knowing they might die. They found the gully through luck and desperation. They broke the German line through courage and violence. And they changed Marine Corps history forever. The story of Belleau Wood reminds us that warfare is ultimately about human beings, their courage, fear, mistakes, and moments of brilliance. A single platoon finding an undefended gully doesn't sound dramatic, but it changed everything. German officers who'd laughed at American cowboys learned to respect and fear Marine determination. French commanders who doubted American fighting ability revised their assessments. And the Marine Corps proved it deserved to exist. What strikes me most about this story is that we don't know their names. The Marines who found that gully, who led the breakthrough, who died in the woods they'd captured, they're anonymous. No medals. No photographs. Just names on casualty lists that families received weeks later. Yet their accomplishment resonates 106 years later. So here's my question for you. If you'd been in that wheat field, bullets cutting down everyone around you, would you have had the courage to keep moving forward? Would you have followed that depression into the woods, knowing you might not come back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into military history, hit that subscribe button. We've got more incredible stories coming. Semper Fi, and I'll see you in the next one.